It starts subtly, not with a dream, but with a comparison, not with a purpose, but with an image. You saw someone, or some version of someone, and something in you whispered, "That's how I should be." And so you began the transformation. Slowly, carefully, obsessively, you adjusted your words, your pace, your desires, not to discover yourself, but to become more acceptable, more admired, more alive in the eyes of others. But here's the truth. You didn't want to live. You wanted to look like you lived well. You wanted the life that photographs well, that speaks the language of social envy, that performs happiness in ways others can recognize and applaud. And in that performance, you began to disappear, because the ideal you were chasing never existed. It was a Frankenstein of filtered moments, half-truths, aspirational lies, a fantasy stitched together from people who aren't as happy as they look, but who've become experts in appearing whole while bleeding privately. And the more you tried to match that ideal, the more you abandoned yourself. Perfectionism isn't about standards. It's a ritual of self-erasure. You curate your personality like a brand. You polish your suffering until it becomes poetic. You perform confidence while anxiety screams behind your eyes. You measure progress by how others see you. You fear stillness because it feels like invisibility. You smile when it hurts, and you work harder, not because you're passionate, but because rest would make you feel like you're falling behind in a race you never wanted to run. This isn't ambition, it's anesthesia, and deep down you know it. You feel the hollowness of every performance. You sense the growing distance between your inner world and the one you sell to others. Carl Jung once wrote about the persona, the mask we wear to survive society. But when the mask becomes the only face we recognize, we don't survive. We dissolve. The worst prison is the one built with applause. And in that prison, you become a project, a never-ending to-do list, a self-improvement machine that never rests, because resting might let the truth surface, that you're terrified of who you are without the performance. You're not chasing a better self. You're escaping the shame of being enough, but there's no redemption in becoming what others want, only in remembering what you already are, beneath the noise, beneath the edits, beneath the act. Let's keep going. There's a strange comfort in dreaming of a different life, a life that's bigger, cleaner, more meaningful, a life where everything makes sense, where you finally feel like you've arrived, not just somewhere new, but somewhere that feels like yours. But sometimes dreaming isn't hope, it's distraction. You say you're building a future, but what you're really doing is fleeing the present. You say you're aiming high, but the truth is you're terrified of stopping, because in the silence, the truth waits, that your ambition isn't rooted in desire, it's rooted in shame. You don't want to succeed, you want to stop feeling like a failure. There's a vast difference. Most people won't tell you this. They'll celebrate your drive, applaud your vision boards and midnight hustle, but they won't see the panic beneath your productivity, the desperation in your discipline, the loneliness behind your goals. Because when you're addicted to the idea of a better life, your current self becomes something you endure, not inhabit. You start treating today like a problem to solve, a holding space for the real you who still hasn't arrived. You call it motivation, but often it's just well-edited despair, and it's seductive. Because the future is clean, untouched, hypothetical. It can't reject you, it can't disappoint you, not like the present can, so you keep building, planning, manifesting, not because you believe in your future, but because it gives you something to hold on to when today feels unbearable. You think you're moving forward, but sometimes you're just running in place. Carl Jung warned that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. And maybe that's what ambition has become for many of us, a noble-sounding escape from the pain of confronting our own emptiness. It's easier to chase success than to sit with silence, easier to dream of change than to grieve what you've lost or what never came. And the tragedy is this: you're not lazy, you're not weak, you're just exhausted from pretending that your suffering has a purpose. You don't need bigger dreams, you need deeper presence. Because maybe the future you keep chasing is just a distraction from the self you refuse to face. And until that changes, nothing else will. There's a haunting rhythm to your life. You begin, you prepare, you plan, but you don't arrive, you don't finish. You hover in a strange space, not failing, not succeeding, just almost ready, almost good enough, almost there. And this almost becomes a form of safety, because as long as something is unfinished, it can still be perfect, still unruined, still full of imagined potential. But this safety comes at a cost, because you're not really living, you're rehearsing, as if your real life is a performance you're never quite ready to go on stage for. And so you linger in drafts, projects half done, words half spoken, feelings half felt, relationships that never deepen because you're always preparing for a better version of yourself to show up. You're addicted to becoming and terrified of being. And somewhere, deep in the silence between your attempts, you sense the truth, that this isn't procrastination, it's protection. If you never truly begin, you never truly fail. If you never show your full self, no one can fully reject you, but it wears you down. Because the illusion starts to rot. You start feeling the emotional decay of a life that's paused itself into oblivion. You lose energy not because you're lazy, but because pretending to move while staying still is the most exhausting lie of all. This is what Nietzsche meant when he spoke of eternal recurrence, the feeling of living the same script again and again without transformation. A cycle where each day promises renewal but delivers repetition. And repetition, when it's hollow, becomes a cage. You start confusing potential with identity. You start defining yourself by what you could be instead of what you are. You live in a permanent state of almost, where dreams protect you from despair, but also from reality. The truth? The fear of finishing is deeper than the fear of failing. Because if you finish and it still isn't enough, then what? So you linger, and you call it perfectionism, or strategy, or planning. But really, it's grief. Grief for the self that's always deferred. Grief for the life that never quite becomes real. But you're not broken. You're not lazy. You're just tired of running from the moment that might finally reveal who you are. Without filters, without edits, without the anesthesia of almost. You used to look in the mirror and see someone. Now, you just see data. You scroll past lives, each one calibrated to perfection, not truth. Faces filtered into gods, bodies postured into symbols of success. And somewhere, between one comparison and the next, your identity starts to dissolve. Not all at once, but in fragments. With every like you don't receive, with every story that reminds you of how far behind you are, with every scroll that turns your self-worth into a scoreboard you never agreed to play on. And this is where it begins, the quiet theft of self. You don't want your life anymore. You want the validation you think others have, the approval they appear to swim in, the confidence they sell with every pose, every caption, every casual "I'm just being real," that somehow still looks cinematic. You begin to vanish, not physically, but spiritually, because your compass no longer points inward, it's outsourced, replaced by algorithms that reward conformity disguised as uniqueness, and your soul, once solid, becomes liquid, adapting, performing, bending to please a gaze that never stops watching, but never truly sees you. You curate your existence like a product. You post feelings you don't feel. You speak in tones borrowed from others. You laugh for audiences you've never met. And slowly, quietly, you trade your truth for traction until your own reflection becomes foreign, until the silence between uploads feels unbearable, until your mood swings with the metrics, until you forget what it felt like to be unseen, but still real. And the worst part, you think this is your fault. You blame yourself for not keeping up, for not being interesting enough, beautiful enough, inspiring enough. But this shame isn't yours. It was installed, programmed, perfectly timed to strike just when you begin to feel free. You're not living, you're broadcasting. And the person watching isn't even you, because what you truly crave isn't attention. It's recognition, not the surface kind, but the rare moment when someone looks into your chaos and says, "I see you, and I'm not leaving." But you can't receive that while hiding behind performances. You can't be loved while being someone else. You can't reclaim your identity until you mourn the one you've been faking, because your reflection, the one that now hates you, isn't real. It's just the echo of who you thought you had to become in order to be loved in a world that only rewards illusions. Before you chased perfection, you chased approval. Before you tried to be everything, you tried to be enough. And maybe that started long before you could name it. Maybe it started the first time you felt love was conditional. That warmth only came when you achieved something. That attention only arrived when you performed right. So you learned the language of compensation. You got better, smarter, quieter, louder, whatever worked. You became a shapeshifter, a child rehearsing safety in a world that made love feel like a reward, not a birthright. And now, as an adult, that pattern hasn't left you. It's just evolved. You still believe you have to earn your place, earn your rest, earn your identity. And that belief is no longer just emotional, it's foundational. You've built your whole life on it, your work, your relationships, your self-worth, all balanced on a fragile truth that if you stop chasing, you might stop being loved. So you sabotage, not because you want to fail, but because failing on your terms hurts less than being rejected after success. You fall before they can push you. You leave before they can abandon you. You dim yourself so no one can accuse you of shining too brightly, too wrongly. And the irony is brutal. You appear driven, ambitious, relentless, but inside, you're just terrified of stillness. Because in stillness, the echo returns. The one that says, you're not good enough yet, not safe yet, not lovable yet. This isn't about laziness or fear of success. It's about survival. You're not chasing a life. You're trying to rewrite a memory. Trying to fix the moment you first felt like who you were wasn't enough to be kept. And that chase, no matter how noble it looks, is rooted in grief. Grief for a childhood that didn't teach you rest. Grief for a love that came with terms and conditions. Grief for the version of you that never got to just be. But grief isn't the end. It's the beginning. Because the moment you name it, not judge it, not run from it, is the moment you begin to inhabit your own life, not as a project, but as a presence, not as someone chasing approval, but as someone quietly reclaiming what should have never been taken. They told you freedom would save you, that having infinite options was the highest form of liberation, that if you could do anything, go anywhere, become anyone, you'd finally feel whole. But they didn't tell you what comes after that. They didn't tell you that too much freedom can feel like falling, that when everything is possible, nothing feels certain, that when no path is clearly yours, every step feels like betrayal of who you were or who you might become. You stand at the intersection of 1,000 lives, and none of them feel like home. You could pivot, you could quit, you could start over, you could disappear, and every one of those options, instead of inspiring you, begins to drown you. Not with pressure, but with the unbearable responsibility of self-definition. Because now, if you fail, it's on you. You weren't forced, you weren't trapped, you chose this. And that guilt, silent, invisible, becomes a shadow that follows every decision, whispering, you had everything, why can't you be happy? But what no one tells you is that too many paths can fracture the self, can create a kind of existential vertigo, a spinning, rootless state where your inner compass starts to glitch, overwhelmed by the illusion of limitless becoming. And so you hesitate. You plan without committing. You start without continuing. You fantasize about a life that would finally feel certain. But you don't believe it exists, because when identity is liquid, action feels dangerous. Every move feels like the wrong one. Even standing still feels like failure. And this is the paradox. Society sold you freedom, but delivered anxiety. You thought you'd feel empowered, but instead you feel paralyzed. This isn't just indecision, it's a crisis of self, because in a world that worships options, choosing means killing every other version of yourself. And who teaches you how to grieve all the lives you didn't live? No one. You're left to mourn in silence, with guilt, with shame, with a faint, aching hope that maybe, just maybe, the answer isn't in choosing better, but in choosing honestly. Not what looks right, not what impresses, but what feels like peace, even if no one claps. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like surrender, like a body that's given up trying to keep the lie alive. You still talk about your dreams. You still write the goals. You still answer, "I'm fine," when someone asks. But inside, something's shifted. There's no pulse in the fantasy anymore. No spark when you imagine the life you said you wanted. Only fatigue, a deep cellular exhaustion that no sleep can fix. Because your body knows. It knows you've been chasing something you don't believe in, that you've been performing hope long after the curtain should have closed, that you've twisted yourself into so many shapes that you can't remember what it feels like to rest inside your own skin. So now, it resists. It forgets your words. It sabotages your plans. It slows you down in quiet rebellion, not out of laziness but out of mercy, because somewhere it knows you can't outrun the truth forever. And the truth is this: you already know that the life you're chasing won't happen. Not because you're incapable, but because it was never real. It was a survival fantasy, a necessary illusion, a story you told yourself to avoid the pain of the present. But now, even that illusion has collapsed. And what remains is this strange, sacred space between what you wanted and what you actually want. It's terrifying, but also honest, because once the noise fades, you can hear it. The quiet whisper beneath the exhaustion, the real longing, the real voice, the one that doesn't care about optics or legacy or applause. It just wants peace and truth and maybe stillness. So you ask yourself with a kind of holy dread, if no one was watching, what would I choose? Not what would impress them, not what would redeem your past, but what would feel like oxygen. And maybe, just maybe, the fatigue you've been calling depression is really just the grief of outgrowing a lie you no longer have the energy to carry. There comes a moment, quiet, anticlimactic, when the illusion breaks. Not with an explosion, but with a sigh. The kind of silence that arrives when you no longer have the strength to pretend. You look at the life you've been chasing, and something inside you stops responding. Not because you've given up, but because you've finally started to see clearly that this dream, this perfect version of you, was never yours. It was inherited, or constructed, or projected, built from pain, from fear, from 1,000 comparisons stitched into a single ghost. And now the ghost is fading, and in its place, there's just space, raw, empty, unfinished. It feels like failure, but it's not. It's the beginning of truth, because real life doesn't start with achievement. It starts with grief, grief for the identity you can no longer sustain, grief for the years spent running toward a mirage, grief for the silence you called strength and the masks you called ambition. But grief isn't weakness, it's clarity in disguise. It forces you to look, not ahead, not behind, but within. To notice the self you abandoned in pursuit of someone who never existed. To remember what joy felt like before it had to be productive. to reclaim the right to live a life that doesn't impress anyone, but nourishes you quietly. Viktor Frankl said, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." But maybe it's not even about change. Maybe it's about remembering the self beneath the performance, the voice that doesn't shout but still speaks, the path that doesn't promise glory, only honesty. You're not failing to live. You're standing at the threshold where illusion ends, and something real, something imperfect, something yours, finally begins. You just need to stop chasing the right lie, so you can finally walk the wrong path, truthfully. There's a grief no one prepares you for, the grief of letting go of who you thought you'd become. You don't cry for what you've lost. You cry for what never was, for the version of you that existed only in your mind. That polished, perfect self you built to survive, to be accepted, to feel safe in a world that punishes softness. And now, standing in the ruins of that fantasy, something strange happens. You breathe, not the breath of victory, not relief, something quieter, something older, like the breath of someone who's finally stopped running. You were never supposed to become that person. Because that person, the one who had it all figured out, who lived without doubt, who moved through life untouched by fear, was never real. They were a response, a defense, a beautiful illusion born from pain. But you are real. In your confusion, in your fatigue, in your stuttering, trembling steps toward something honest. You've spent years trying to fix what was never broken. Years trying to live a life that was never yours. Years chasing applause for a performance you didn't believe in. But life begins the moment the script falls apart. The moment you stop trying to make your pain poetic. The moment you stop selling your suffering as ambition. The moment you admit, not to the world, but to yourself, I don't want this anymore. And that doesn't mean failure. It means return. Return to presence, to the now. To the only place where change is possible, to the only place where healing is real. There is no final version of you. There is no perfect outcome waiting at the end of this. There is only this moment, raw, unfinished enough. And if you can stand here, stripped of illusion, held only by truth, then you've already begun. Because you're not failing to live, you're simply shedding the self that was never meant to survive. And beneath it, something ancient stirs, not perfection, not clarity, but the quiet, sacred permission to begin again, imperfectly, honestly, completely.